Hello, this is a Pacesetter training video on using labor minimums in Xactimate. So before we begin, let's talk a little bit about what labor minimums are. Basically what they are a set amount of money that varies by trade, and it varies by the price database that you may be using in Xactimate, but it's a set amount of money that's a minimum charge or a minimum amount of money that's a reasonable amount of money to pay a contractor to come to and from a job site and do a small job. For instance, if we have gutter and downspout damage on a claim, and the only damage to the gutters and downspouts are 10 feet of downspout, and the database pays $75 for 10 feet of downspout to remove and replace, it's not really a reasonable cost for a contractor to come to a job site to drive to do that. Most contractors are not going to drive out there for $75 to do 10 feet of downspout. So in that case, we can apply a labor minimum in Xactimate. And let's say the labor minimum in the price database we're using for gutters and downspouts is $300. If we have a line item paying $75, that leaves a $225 adjusted amount or excess that we can add to the estimate and pay the insured for the contractor up to $300. So we can apply that in the claim, add that additional $225, which with the line item would pay a total of $300 to the contractor. And that certainly is a reasonable amount of money for them to come out and do 10 feet of downspout. So that's basically the concept behind labor minimum. So let's look at how we apply these and do some editing to those. So first, understand that whenever you drop any line items in Xactimate, whatever those line items may be, by trade, it's going to automatically in the background trigger the labor minimums for that trade to be placed in a list in the labor minimums tab, which we're going to look at shortly. So in this case, I have some roofing line items in a roofing room. We can look at the category of the line items or the trade. These are all roofing. We have an HVC or an HVAC line item, an electrical line item. This is detaching and resetting a satellite dish. And then we have a demo. Let me open this up a little bit so we can see these a little bit better. This is a DMO. This would be the dumpster. Okay, so let's look at the dining room. And under the category or trade codes, we have contents, paint, drywall, insulation. Again, drywall. This is texture. Paint, cleaning. Okay, so we have a number of trades in this estimate. So let's go to the labor minimums tab. So this is the tab right here. Before we go here, keep in mind that once you get your estimate completed and you've checked your work, you have all your line items, you've set all your depreciations and your quantities are correct, your text notes are correct, and you're ready to move on to go to maybe your invoice or your narrative report, always, 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 on every claim you do, go check labor minimums and see if you need to apply any labor minimums, because you may be leaving money on the table for the insured that we may owe them, and those labor minimums might kick the fee schedule up for your invoice up to the next tier. So it may mean that you are leaving money on the table for you as well, but we certainly may be leaving money on the table for the insured, and we want to make sure we pay them everything that we can that's owed to them. So to get to the labor minimums, again, up at the top, when you're in your estimates, select the labor minimums tab, and then here's our list of triggered labor minimums. Once you get here, basically what you do is go down the adjusted column. And by the way, before we do this, under the base amount, this is the labor minimum or the minimum charge for this price database for these various trades. As you can see, it varies in amount. $660.56 is the labor minimum for roofing in this price database that I'm using. Another example for instance, let's go down to paint, P&T, $227.36. That's the labor minimum for paint in this price database. So again, that's under the base amount column. This is just another word for the labor minimum or the minimum amount of money for that trade. If you wanted to see what these numbers are, this is where you would look. But what you really want to look at is this column, adjusted amount. What you do is go down and start at the top. If you see $0 in this column for a particular trade, you can move on. There is no adjusted amount that we can apply. In this case, roofing, we already have line items in the estimate because we're replacing the roof. We already have line items associated with roofing that are exceeding the labor minimum of $660. So again, we're not going to go back and look, but let's say the roof we're replacing and there's $12,000. Well, that is far, far beyond a labor minimum for roofing of $660. So Xactimate says, nope, there's no extra money left over for the labor minimum for you to add. Okay, great. Let's move on. The next one is HVAC, $290.89. So what you do is you look at this and say, what's triggering this? And that we saw this before, it was that furnace vent. That's what the line item is triggering this. This is something you'll commonly see that you have to decide. That's a little bit tricky. You'll see it commonly on roofing when you're replacing roofs or slopes that have furnace vents. And you'll also see that on interiors with drywall and insulation. We'll get to that in a second. So what you do is decide, do I need to apply this labor minimum? And the trigger is who is going to do the work. So if this labor minimum, HVAC, is being triggered by a vent on a roof, a furnace vent, who's going to do the work? Who's going to put that vent on? The roofer is going to do that. Since we're already paying the roofer to replace the entire roof and we're paying an ample amount of money to do that, we're not going to pay to hire a second separate contractor to come out and put one vent on. The roofer will do that work. So therefore, this labor minimum, even though there's an adjusted amount available to us to apply, we're not going to apply this by checking this box. We'll leave it alone. So moving on, we'll go down to the next labor minimum. For labor, again, we're not going to use this because we're not allowed to apply labor minimums just on straight labor. We can apply labor minimums on hard trades. So we'll just skip that. Painting, yes, we can do that. That's paint. That's a hard trade. It's using materials. In this case, the adjusted amount is $0. There's no amount left over this $227 labor minimum to apply. So that means the line items that we're doing for paint in the estimate are already exceeding this amount. So there's nothing to add. The next is drywall. We have an excess that we can add, $445.77. We're going to add that because there is going to have to be a drywall contractor to come out to do the drywall work. Let's check that box and we're going to apply that labor minimum. And as you'll see, it highlights now. Let's keep going. The next is cleaning, and we have an adjusted amount available. Again, this is not a hard trade. This is basically labor. We are not allowed to apply labor minimums for pure labor or non-hard trades. The last is insulation. That is a hard trade. It is insulation we're doing with some drywall repair in a room. There is an adjusted amount available. The question is, again, like the vent up here, who's going to do this work? Normally, the drywall contractor is going to do insulation work. They're going to cut the drywall out that's damaged, pull it down, pull the insulation out, put the new insulation back up, spray antimicrobial in the opening, seal up the opening with a new drywall, tape, float, and mud it, and then it's going to be ready for paint or texture. So in this case, you have to think, who's going to do the work? Who's going to do the insulation? Are we going to pay a labor minimum of $445 to a drywall contractor? And then are we going to pay an additional $253 to a separate contractor to come out just to do the insulation work? No, we are not. We are going to say that the drywall contractor is going to do the insulation work. We're already paying them a labor minimum, so we're not going to apply this labor minimum. Sometimes, like in this case, there may be 2 or 3 trades that one tradesman is going to do. You have to look at that and determine who's going to do that, even if it's more than 1, 2, or 3 trades. If all of those trades are going to be handled by one contractor, then you would apply one of those labor minimums, and it's typically going to be the larger, the greater amount. Pay the insured the most amount of money that you can if you're going to apply a labor minimum. Okay, so one last thing on labor minimums before we look at the estimate to see, and again, these show up at the bottom of the estimate. Whichever labor minimums that you apply, they are going to show up in a separate labor minimum area at the bottom of the estimate at the end of all the line items and everything, that the insured can see what labor minimums have been applied. One other thing we want to do that you can clean this up, and some carriers may require you to do this, is reassociating line items so that they don't get confused and they're built into the trade, so they're already built in. In other words, insulation for this case, we established that the drywall guy is going to do that, but we still have a separate labor minimum showing up because we have an insulation line item. But we can go to that line item for insulation and we can tell Xactimate, no, I don't want you to associate this insulation line item with insulation trade. I want you to reassociate it to the drywall trade. And that means that it'll be automatically internally combined into the drywall. So let's go back and see how to do that. So let's go back to the items tab here. We're moving away from the labor minimums tab back to items. And then go down to the dining room, find our insulation line item right here. This is the blown insulation. So to get to this area, we're going to click on the line item and highlight it. And then up in the quick entry area to the right, we're going to select, excuse me, unit price. And as you'll notice, this opens up where we can select O&P, non-O&P, make it tax exempt, and there's various options here. But if you'll notice, there's a little drop-down menu here, minimum group. If we drop this menu down, it will show the various trades that we currently have activated in this claim. And we see that drywall is here. So we're going to select this. And now we're telling Xactimate, I want you to reassociate this insulation line item no longer with the insulation trade, but I want you to reassociate it to the drywall trade. So now we just reassociated one trade to another trade. So if we click OK, and now if we go back to our labor minimums, we will see that the insulation trade is now gone. Even though that line item is there in the estimate and the trade is insulation, since we've reassociated it to the drywall, now it's embedded into the drywall. And if you'll notice, the adjusted amount is lower because we've included that in there. That's really the correct way to do this. Not necessarily required by AFIX, but it's generally in the industry the correct way to do labor minimums. But if your manager or if the file reviewer or somebody comes down, or the DA or the carrier specifically requests that we do this, you know how to do it now. Again, as always, if you have any questions on this or anything else as far as processing claims go, please call your account manager or claim supervisor with Pacesetter, and we will be happy to help you, and we hope you have a great day.